Get her out of first class before she steals something. Claire Whitmore's voice cracked through the quiet cabin with such confidence that conversations stopped mid-sentence and every head turned towards seat 1A. The words didn't sound emotional. They sounded practiced, polished, almost rehearsed, as though she had delivered the same judgment before. Danielle Brooks stood perfectly still in the aisle, one hand resting on the leather headrest beside her assigned seat, while her boarding pass remained calmly between two fingers. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Claire with the kind of steady expression that made silence feel heavier than shouting. Around them, passengers exchanged uncertain glances. A businessman lowered his tablet. A young mother removed one earbud. Even the flight attendants working farther down the cabin slowed their movements, sensing that something had shifted long before the aircraft ever pushed back from the gate. Claire folded her arms and took one deliberate step closer. Economy is in the back. Stop pretending this seat belongs to you. Her smile never reached her eyes. Danielle slowly looked down at the boarding pass, still displaying seat 1A, then back at Claire. It does belong to me, she answered quietly. The system says otherwise, Claire replied without even checking the barcode again. Behind Danielle, Ethan Walsh adjusted the expensive blazer hanging over his shoulder and sighed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Some of us actually paid for first class, he muttered. Claire immediately turned toward him with a sympathetic smile. I'm so sorry for the delay, sir. We'll have this resolved in just a moment. Danielle noticed the difference immediately. Ethan had never been asked for identification. No one questioned whether he belonged. No one suggested he might be in the wrong cabin. He simply looked like the version of success Claire expected to see. Danielle glanced at the digital clock mounted near the boarding door. 28 minutes remained before departure. She quietly reached into her jacket pocket, removed her phone, and placed one call. The line connected before the first ring. Could finish. Naomi. I'm here, came the calm reply. Danielle never looked away from Claire. Start the clock. Naomi paused only long enough to understand exactly what those 3 words meant. Understood. 28 minutes. The call ended. Claire laughed softly. Calling someone to invent a better story? Danielle slipped her phone back into her pocket without responding. She had learned years ago that people determined to underestimate you rarely listened to explanations. They listened only to consequences. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Danielle Brooks. The cabin door remained open as another flight attendant whispered something into Claire's ear. Claire barely acknowledged it before extending her hand. Your boarding pass. Danielle handed it over without hesitation. Claire glanced at it for less than a second before shaking her head dramatically. Interesting, she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. This reservation doesn't appear to exist anymore. A ripple of whispers moved through the first-class cabin. Danielle remained exactly where she was. Not 1 inch forward. Not 1 inch back. Marcus Hill, seated across the aisle, frowned as he watched the exchange unfold. He had seen Danielle scan her boarding pass successfully less than 5 minutes earlier. So had several others. Yet nobody spoke. Not yet. Outside the windows, baggage crews continued loading luggage beneath the bright afternoon sun while the jet bridge remained connected. Inside, the temperature somehow felt colder. Claire tucked Danielle's boarding pass beneath her tablet and pointed toward the rear of the aircraft. Last chance, she said. Walk to economy on your own, or airport security will escort you off this airplane. Danielle looked at her for another long second before quietly answering. No, Claire. In exactly 28 minutes, no one on this airline will be going anywhere. Danielle Brooks had boarded without an assistant, without a security detail, and without a single designer label announcing her success to the world. That had been intentional. 24 hours earlier, Aerovana Group had quietly finalized operational control of Crown Meridian Airlines, but the transition had not yet become public knowledge beyond regulators and the executive board. Danielle insisted on delaying every press release because she wanted one thing before cameras, interviews, and celebration. She wanted the truth. For months, anonymous complaints had arrived through internal ethics channels describing passengers who felt they had been judged before anyone looked at their tickets. The reports were strangely similar. Travelers described being questioned because of their clothing, asked for unnecessary identification, or quietly moved from premium seats after boarding. Every investigation seemed to end with the same conclusion: insufficient evidence. Employee followed procedure. Complaint closed. Danielle had read every page herself. The language was polished, but something about it felt too clean, too rehearsed, as if the paperwork had been written to protect a reputation instead of discovering facts. That was why she had booked seat 1A using her legal name without notifying anyone inside the airline. She wore dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple navy sweater that could have belonged to any traveler rushing to a business meeting. No luxury handbag, no expensive jewelry, no visible symbol of authority. She wanted every employee she encountered to make a decision based only on what they believed they saw. Earlier that afternoon, she had entered the terminal carrying a single leather backpack and a cup of black coffee purchased near the security checkpoint. Families hurried toward departure gates. Business travelers balanced laptops while speaking through wireless headsets. Nobody recognized her, exactly as she expected. At the boarding gate, the agent smiled warmly after scanning her boarding pass. The screen flashed green. Seat 1A confirmed. Priority boarding approved. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Danielle thanked the agent, walked down the jet bridge, and stepped onto the aircraft believing the first part of her quiet inspection had gone exactly as planned. Then she noticed Claire Whitmore. Even before a single word was spoken, Claire's expression lingered just a little too long on Danielle's clothes, then on her face, then back to the boarding pass. It was not curiosity. It was calculation. Danielle had seen that look before. She remembered being 23 years old after closing her first major real estate deal. A receptionist at an upscale office building had asked whether she was delivering lunch because, in her words, executives usually arrive through another entrance. Years later, after building companies worth billions, the expression had never completely disappeared. The buildings changed. The uniforms changed. The excuses changed. The assumption remained remarkably consistent. Back in the cabin, Danielle watched Claire unlock the service tablet mounted near the forward galley. Claire tapped through several screens while keeping Danielle within the corner of her vision. Megan Cole, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, happened to glance at the display while organizing welcome beverages. Her eyes narrowed for only a moment. She had personally watched Danielle's boarding pass scan successfully minutes earlier, yet the seating chart suddenly refreshed. Seat 1A blinked once. Danielle Brooks disappeared. Ethan Walsh appeared in her place. Megan stared at the screen, convinced she had misread it. Then she saw Claire quietly close the application before anyone else could notice. A chill ran through her as she realized she had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. Before she could decide whether to speak, Claire reached for the cabin phone and requested airport security to report immediately to the aircraft for what she described as an uncooperative passenger attempting to occupy a premium seat without authorization. The request for airport security traveled through the cabin speaker with cold efficiency, as though the decision had already been made before anyone had asked a single honest question. Claire Whitmore slipped Danielle Brooks's boarding pass beneath her service tablet and folded her hands with quiet satisfaction. "We have procedures for situations like this," she announced, making sure every nearby passenger could hear her. "Please cooperate so we do not delay this flight any further." Danielle remained standing beside seat 1A. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing never changed. She simply looked through the cabin windows toward the busy ramp, where fuel trucks rolled past and baggage handlers continued loading suitcases beneath the afternoon sun. The aircraft looked ready for departure. Inside, however, something much heavier than luggage had already been loaded. Ethan Walsh stepped forward carrying the confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned. "Can we move this along?" he asked. "Some of us have meetings waiting in Los Angeles." Claire nodded sympathetically. "We are doing everything we can, sir." Then she turned back toward Danielle. "You have one final opportunity to leave the first-class cabin voluntarily." Danielle answered with the same calm voice that had unsettled Claire from the beginning. "You have not scanned my boarding pass a second time. You have not verified my reservation. You have only assumed I do not belong here." Claire smiled without warmth. "Experience teaches us to recognize situations before computers do." The sentence hung in the air like a confession disguised as professionalism. Marcus Hill slowly stood from his aisle seat. I watched her board, he said. Her pass scanned green at the aircraft door. We all saw it. Claire barely acknowledged him. Sir, please remain seated. This does not concern you. Marcus did not sit down. The moment someone is judged without facts, it concerns everybody watching. Several passengers quietly looked at one another. A woman in the second row lowered the magazine she had been reading. Another traveler reached for a phone but hesitated, unsure whether recording would help or only make the situation worse. Megan Cole felt her heartbeat quicken. She could still picture the seating chart changing before her eyes. She had been trained that every seat modification left a digital record. Systems did not simply erase confirmed passengers. Someone had to authorize the change. Her eyes drifted toward Claire's tablet again. Claire noticed immediately and turned the screen away. At that moment, the cockpit door opened and Captain Thomas Reed stepped into the first-class cabin. His uniform carried instant authority, and the conversations around him stopped. Claire wasted no time. Captain, this passenger is refusing crew instructions after occupying a premium seat without authorization. Thomas looked directly at Danielle instead of the boarding pass. Ma'am, I need you to cooperate with my crew. Danielle met his eyes. Captain, did anyone show you my reservation? He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. My crew has already verified the situation. Danielle asked another question just as quietly. Personally, or through someone else's opinion? Thomas did not respond. Instead, he nodded toward the open aircraft door where two airport security officers had just stepped onto the jet bridge. Megan felt her stomach tighten because she knew something the captain did not. Claire had never verified anything. She had rewritten it. As the officers walked closer, Danielle glanced once more at the clock above the boarding door. 22 minutes remained. Then her phone vibrated softly. A single message from Naomi appeared across the screen. Protocol initiated. Flight data preservation complete. Hidden audit recovered. Danielle read the message once, locked her phone, and lifted her eyes toward Claire with the faintest hint of certainty, while Megan realized that whatever had just been recovered was about to change everything. The two airport security officers stepped into the aircraft with measured professionalism, their expressions neutral as they approached the front of the first-class cabin. Neither one reached for Danielle Brooks. They simply waited for an explanation. Claire Whitmore spoke before anyone else could. This passenger refuses to leave a seat that is no longer assigned to her and is delaying departure. One of the officers nodded politely. Ma'am, may we see your boarding pass? Claire answered instead. I already have it. She tapped the tablet resting against her arm. The reservation has been removed from the system. Danielle remained composed. Would you mind asking how it disappeared? The officer turned toward Claire. Can we review the boarding skin history? Claire's smile tightened for the first time. That will not be necessary. Megan Cole felt her pulse racing. Every instinct told her to remain silent. She was only 6 weeks into her first assignment as a flight attendant. Challenging a senior crew member could end her career before it truly began. Yet the image on Claire's tablet refused to leave her mind. She had watched the seating chart change with her own eyes. Danielle had not disappeared from the system. Someone had made her disappear. Marcus Hill broke the silence again. If everything was handled correctly, showing the records should solve this in 30 seconds. A few passengers quietly nodded in agreement. Even Ethan Walsh shifted uneasily in the aisle. What had seemed like a simple misunderstanding was beginning to feel different. Claire crossed her arms. Passengers do not decide airline procedures. Danielle answered calmly. Neither does prejudice. The words landed softly, but the cabin became even quieter. Captain Thomas Reed looked toward the security officers. We cannot continue delaying this flight. One of the officers responded carefully. Captain, we also cannot remove someone if there is uncertainty about the passenger manifest. Thomas frowned. That was not the answer he expected. Claire immediately unlocked her tablet again. I will show you. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. Then she stopped. The display froze. A spinning icon appeared where the seating chart should have been. Claire tapped again. Nothing happened. She tried closing the application. It refused to respond. Her confidence faded by a fraction, barely noticeable to most people, but impossible for Megan to miss. Danielle quietly watched without saying a word. Her phone vibrated once more inside her jacket, but she did not look at it. She already knew what Naomi had done. The airline's central audit system had locked every live record connected to this flight before anyone could alter another piece of evidence. Claire finally looked up. The network must be having issues. Danielle tilted her head slightly. Interesting timing. Megan took a slow breath before finding the courage she did not know she possessed. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling at first, "I need to report something." Every face turned toward her. Claire's eyes widened. "Megan, this is not the time." Megan swallowed hard but continued. "I watched Miss Brooks board this aircraft. Her boarding pass scanned successfully. Then I saw seat 1 Alpha change on the seating chart after she entered the cabin." Claire immediately interrupted. "You are confused." Megan shook her head. "No, ma'am. I remember because I thought it was unusual." Captain Reed stared at Megan, then at Claire, then back at the frozen tablet in Claire's hands. For the first time since stepping into the cabin, uncertainty replaced authority on his face. Claire's composure began slipping away. "She is a trainee," Claire said quickly. "She probably misunderstood what she saw." Danielle finally spoke again. "Then let the audit decide who misunderstood." At that exact moment, every device connected to the aircraft reservation system chimed simultaneously. Claire's tablet, the captain's flight display, the gate computer visible through the open aircraft door. A bright notification appeared across every screen with the same message. Administrative audit mode activated. Manual seat modification detected. Review required before departure. The cabin fell completely silent as Captain Thomas Reed slowly lifted his eyes toward Claire, realizing the system itself had just contradicted everything she had claimed. Captain Thomas Reed stared at the warning across his flight display as though it might disappear if he waited long enough. It did not. Administrative audit mode remained fixed across every connected screen, followed by a detailed notice confirming that seat 1A had been reassigned manually after Danielle Brooks had already boarded the aircraft. The silence inside the cabin became impossible to ignore. Claire Whitmore quickly stepped forward, trying to reclaim control before anyone else could read further. "This has to be a software error," she insisted. "The system has been unreliable all week." One of the airport security officers calmly shook his head. "Our records show the audit originated from corporate headquarters, not from the aircraft." Claire's face tightened. "Then someone at headquarters made a mistake." Danielle looked at her without anger. "You seem very comfortable blaming everyone except the person who touched the system." Ethan Walsh slowly stood from seat 1A and looked toward Claire. Only minutes earlier he had accepted her version of events without question. Now uncertainty had replaced confidence. "Are you saying that seat was actually hers all along?" Claire hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "The assignment changed." Danielle answered before Claire could continue. "The assignment was changed." The difference between the two sentences settled heavily over the cabin. Megan Cole quietly stepped closer to Captain Reed. "Sir, there is something else you should know." She unlocked her company phone and opened the internal training application, where temporary screenshots were automatically stored whenever crew members reported technical issues. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the screen toward him. The image clearly showed Danielle Brooks listed in seat 1A with a green boarding confirmation timestamp. The next screenshot, taken less than 2 minutes later, showed Ethan Walsh occupying the same seat after a manual override. Captain Reed looked from the screen to Claire in disbelief. "Why was this never reported?" Claire answered immediately. She should not have saved internal records. Megan met her supervisor's eyes. "I saved them because I knew something was wrong." Danielle remained completely still, but the sight of those screenshots awakened a memory she had carried for more than 2 decades. She remembered standing beside her mother inside another airport terminal when she was only 19 years old. Her mother had held 2 perfectly valid boarding passes while an airline employee insisted there had been a mistake. A white passenger wanted the window seats they had reserved. Instead of correcting the error, the airline quietly asked Danielle and her mother to wait for the next flight. As they sat together, watching their airplane leave without them, her mother had smiled despite the disappointment and whispered words Danielle never forgot. "Never allow someone else's suspicion to become your identity." That sentence had followed Danielle through every boardroom, every negotiation, and every impossible decision she had faced while building her companies. It was the reason she never confused calmness with weakness. Back in the present, one of the security officers respectfully addressed Danielle. Ma'am, based on what we are seeing, you are free to remain where you are until this review is complete. Claire immediately protested. If she stays here, this aircraft cannot depart. Danielle glanced once more toward the clock near the boarding door. 18 minutes remained. She slowly removed her phone from her pocket as another message from Naomi appeared. Full audit recovered. Executive authorization required for next phase. Danielle read the words carefully before locking the screen again. Then she lifted her eyes toward Captain Reed and spoke with quiet certainty. Captain, what happens over the next 18 minutes will determine far more than today's departure. Before anyone could respond, the cockpit communication panel began ringing with an incoming priority call marked Executive Operations Immediate. The priority call echoed through the cockpit speaker with a sharp tone that instantly drew every eye toward Captain Thomas Reed. He reached for the handset, expecting routine operational instructions, but the moment he pressed the button, his expression changed. Captain Reed speaking. A composed voice answered from the other end. This is Victor Lang, Executive Vice President of Operations. Captain, I need an immediate status report on Flight 487. Thomas glanced toward Claire Whitmore before replying. We have a seating dispute involving one passenger. The situation is being resolved. Danielle Brooks quietly folded her hands in front of her. She already knew Victor would call. Naomi had ensured that every executive with authority over flight operations was now watching the incident unfold through the live audit portal. Victor paused before asking his next question. Captain, has administrative audit mode been activated on your aircraft? Thomas hesitated. Yes. Another brief silence followed. Then nothing about this situation is routine anymore. Claire stepped closer, trying to reclaim control. Sir, this passenger presented herself as entitled to seat 1 Alpha after the reservation changed. We have followed company procedures. Victor did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question that caught everyone by surprise. Who authorized the manual seat reassignment? Claire swallowed. The system required an operational adjustment. Victor's voice became noticeably firmer. That was not my question. Claire looked toward Captain Reed, hoping he would answer for her. He remained silent. Megan Cole lowered her eyes, realizing the truth was beginning to move faster than anyone could stop it. Danielle calmly unlocked her phone and read another message from Naomi. Live compliance review complete. Historical records linked. Danielle typed only 3 words in response. Proceed to Phase 2. Seconds later, every company tablet connected to the aircraft refreshed again. This time the screen displayed an audit timeline. Boarding completed. Seat 1 Alpha verified. Manual override executed. Employee credentials identified. Authorization pending review. Claire stared at her own employee identification number highlighted beside the override record. Her breathing became noticeably uneven. This is impossible, she whispered. Danielle finally looked directly at her. No, it is documented. Marcus Hill quietly smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Facts have a way of catching up. Ethan Walsh slowly picked up his carry-on bag and stepped away from seat 1 Alpha. Miss Brooks, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. I accepted what I was told because it sounded official. Danielle nodded politely. Authority deserves respect only when it respects the truth. Even the airport security officers exchanged brief glances. What had started as a passenger dispute now looked increasingly like an internal corporate investigation. Captain Reed returned to the cockpit phone. Mr. Lang, what would you like us to do? Victor answered without hesitation. Maintain the current hold. Nobody leaves the aircraft until executive review is complete. Claire's eyes widened. Sir, delaying departure over one seating mistake will disrupt the entire schedule. Victor replied with unexpected calm. Claire, if this is only a seating mistake, the records will prove it. If it is not, delaying one flight will be the smallest problem this airline faces today. The words settled over the cabin with enormous weight. Danielle glanced toward the departure clock again. 14 minutes remained. She remembered telling Naomi to start the clock because she knew truth needed only one thing to become unstoppable. Time. Her phone vibrated one more time. Naomi's latest message contained only a single sentence. Board chair has joined the live review. Identity disclosure authorized whenever you are ready. Danielle slipped the phone back into her pocket without showing anyone. Across the cabin, Claire was still trying to convince herself the situation could somehow be explained away. unaware that within the next few minutes the people responsible for her paycheck were about to learn exactly whom she had spent the last half hour trying to remove from first class. The cabin no longer felt like the beginning of an ordinary flight. It felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye remained fixed on Danielle Brooks as she stood quietly beside seat 1A with the same calm expression she had worn since the first accusation. Captain Thomas Reed looked from the audit display to Danielle, then back toward Claire Whitmore. The confidence that had filled the front of the cabin 30 minutes earlier had almost completely disappeared. Claire tried one final time to regain control. "Captain, we cannot let one passenger hold an entire aircraft hostage." Danielle answered before Thomas could speak. "No one here is being held hostage. The truth is simply refusing to leave." Her words landed with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew how the next few minutes would unfold. The cockpit communication panel rang again. Thomas immediately answered. "Victor." Lang's voice came through the speaker. "Captain Reed, place this call on the cabin audio system. Everyone involved needs to hear what comes next." Thomas hesitated only briefly before activating the overhead speaker. Victor continued in a measured tone. "Before we proceed, I want confirmation. Is Danielle Brooks still on board flight 487? Thomas looked directly at Danielle. "Yes, sir." Another pause followed. Then Victor spoke with deliberate clarity. "For the record, Danielle Brooks is the Chief Executive Officer of Aerovanda Group, the controlling owner of Crown Meridian Airlines. Every executive participating in this review has now confirmed her identity." The words seemed to drain every sound from the aircraft. Ethan Walsh slowly lowered his eyes. Marcus Hill exhaled quietly as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Megan Cole covered her mouth in disbelief. Claire simply stared at Danielle, unable to process what she had just heard. Captain Reed took one step backward. "Chief Executive Officer," he whispered. Danielle finally moved towards seat 1A, not with triumph, but with complete composure. She stopped beside Claire and looked directly into her eyes. "You never questioned my boarding pass," she said softly. "You questioned whether a black woman dressed like me deserved to belong in first class." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. Danielle continued. "You believed appearance was stronger than evidence. You believed confidence belonged only to the people who looked familiar to you. Even after your own system proved you wrong, you kept defending the decision instead of correcting it." Nobody interrupted her. Nobody could. Danielle slowly turned toward the rest of the cabin. This was never about one seat. It was about the standards that decide who receives dignity before facts are even considered. She looked at Captain Reed. "Captain, misunderstandings in the moment facts appear. What happened here continued long after the facts were available." Thomas lowered his head. "You are right." Claire finally found her voice. "I did not know who you were." Danielle answered immediately. "That is exactly the point. You should not have needed to know." The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Victor returned to the speaker. "Miss Brooks, executive authority has been transferred to you. The board chair is listening live. We are awaiting your decision." Danielle glanced once more toward the departure clock. 8 minutes remained before scheduled pushback. She did not sit down. She did not reclaim seat 1A. Instead, she removed her phone and opened the final audit summary Naomi had prepared. Her eyes moved across the report for only a few seconds before her expression changed for the first time that afternoon. It was not anger. It was disappointment. She slowly looked back toward the cockpit speaker and said, "Victor, this incident is much larger than Claire Whitmore." The cabin froze again as Victor answered with a voice noticeably quieter than before. "I was afraid you were going to say that. The expanded audit has just finished, and what it uncovered changes everything." Victor Lang took a slow breath before continuing. The emergency audit did not stop with today's flight. Once administrative audit mode was activated, it automatically reviewed every manual seat reassignment completed over the past 18 months. No one inside the cabin spoke. Even the airport security officers remained motionless. Danielle Brooks quietly read the report displayed on her phone while Victor summarized the findings for everyone listening. 47 customer complaints involving allegations of discriminatory treatment were closed without complete investigation. 12 premium seat assignments were manually altered after passengers had already boarded. 6 incident reports were rewritten before reaching the corporate ethics office. Multiple employee credentials were used to override reservation records without proper supervisory approval. Claire Whitmore slowly shook her head. That cannot be right. Victor answered immediately. Every change has been verified by independent audit logs that cannot be edited by flight crews. Captain Thomas Reed looked at the report on his own display, his face growing paler with every page. I never saw any of these records. Danielle finally looked up from her phone. Because someone made certain you never would. Marcus Hill quietly folded his arms. This was never one person's bad decision. It became a system that protected itself. Megan Cole lowered her eyes, realizing the complaints she had heard whispered by experienced crew members suddenly made sense. Travelers had not imagined what happened to them. Many of them had simply been ignored. Ethan Walsh stood silently beside seat 1A, no longer concerned about where he would sit. He was thinking about the people whose stories had probably ended before anyone believed them. Victor continued. Miss Brooks, the audit also identified procedural failures affecting operational integrity. If reservation records can be altered without proper authorization, other compliance records must be reviewed immediately. Danielle nodded once. Exactly. She slowly turned toward Captain Reed. Captain, aviation depends on trust. Every passenger believes the manifest is accurate. Every crew member believes the records are reliable. If the integrity of operational data has been compromised, this is no longer a customer service issue. Thomas completed the sentence for her. It becomes a safety issue. Danielle answered quietly. Now you understand. Claire's voice was barely audible. I never intended for anything to become this large. Danielle met her eyes without hostility. Intent does not erase consequences. Every time someone changes the truth to match an assumption, the entire system becomes weaker. Victor spoke again. The board is requesting your operational decision, Miss Brooks. Danielle looked once more at the departure clock. Only 2 minutes remained before scheduled pushback. Outside the aircraft window, another Crown Meridian jet slowly taxied toward the active runway while ground crews continued preparing departures across the airport. Everything appeared normal. Danielle knew it was not. She pressed one button on her phone, confirming the executive authorization Naomi had prepared long before anyone else understood where the investigation was leading. Seconds later, every operations display inside the cockpit refreshed simultaneously. Dispatch alerts began, appearing across the network. Flight status review. Immediate executive hold. Await further instructions. Captain Reed stared at the growing list of notifications. These messages are going to every operations center. Victor answered in a calm voice that carried the weight of history. Yes, Captain. Every airport. Every dispatcher. Every flight crew. Danielle slowly lifted her head and spoke with absolute certainty. Until we know every operational record can be trusted again, not one more aircraft under this company's name leaves the ground. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, through the cockpit windows, the departure board at the gate refreshed, changing the flight status from on time to ground hold, while new alerts began cascading through the airline's nationwide network. For several long seconds, the aircraft remained perfectly still, but beyond the cabin windows, the effect of Danielle Brooks's decision spread with astonishing speed. Pushback vehicles stopped where they were. Taxi clearances were suspended. Dispatch centers across the country acknowledged the executive order one airport after another. Pilots waiting on active taxiways received the same instruction. Hold position until further notice. Flight crews exchanged confused looks as operations screens displayed the identical message. Mandatory integrity review in progress. Danielle quietly slipped her phone into her pocket and finally walked to seat 1A. She did not sit down. The seat no longer mattered. Claire Whitmore stood frozen, her confidence completely gone. The authority she had relied upon less than half an hour earlier had vanished, replaced by the undeniable weight of documented truth. Captain Thomas Reed stepped forward and removed his cap. Miss Brooks, he said with sincere humility, I should have verified the facts myself instead of accepting assumptions. I failed you as a passenger, and I failed everyone aboard this aircraft. Danielle nodded respectfully. Captain, leadership is not measured by never making mistakes. It is measured by what you do once the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Thomas lowered his head in quiet agreement. Megan Cole stood nearby, still holding the phone that had preserved the screenshots no one else believed would matter. Danielle smiled warmly at her. You spoke when remaining silent would have been easier. Companies become stronger because of people like you. Megan felt tears gather in her eyes, but quickly composed herself. I only told the truth. Danielle answered softly. That is exactly why it mattered. Ethan Walsh approached next. I judged the situation before I understood it. I am sorry. Danielle accepted his apology without hesitation. Thank you. Respect begins the moment we are willing to question our own assumptions. Marcus Hill looked around the silent cabin and quietly said, Today was never about first class. It was about being seen as fully human before anyone decided who deserved respect. Danielle looked at him and smiled. Exactly. The cockpit speaker came alive once more. Victor Lang addressed everyone aboard. Effective immediately, Claire Whitmore is relieved of flight duty, pending the outcome of an independent investigation. All employees connected to unauthorized reservation overrides will be placed on administrative leave while the review continues. Every customer complaint identified in today's audit will be reopened and evaluated by an outside ethics panel. The board has unanimously approved these actions. Claire closed her eyes, realizing the consequences extended far beyond a single afternoon. Danielle did not celebrate. She did not raise her voice. She did not humiliate anyone in return. Instead, she looked toward the passengers who had quietly witnessed everything unfold. Every person who walks onto one of our aircraft deserves to be welcomed before being judged. A boarding pass should open a seat, not invite suspicion. From this day forward, dignity will be treated as an essential part of safety because a company cannot claim excellence while allowing prejudice to shape its decisions. The cabin remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows undeniable truth. Outside, operations teams began preparing for a company-wide review that would change policies, training, oversight, and accountability across the airline. Danielle finally turned toward the open aircraft door and stepped into the jet bridge with the same quiet confidence she had carried onto the airplane. 28 minutes earlier, she had been told she did not belong in first class. 28 minutes later, an entire airline had stopped moving, not because one black woman lost her seat, but because one leader refused to let an institution keep flying while its integrity remained grounded. She never raised her voice. She raised the standard, and that standard would carry every future passenger farther than any single flight ever could.